Whew, I sure didn't need that nap after uploading my last video. But what day is it? Welcome back to Crystalized. I'm not a goner, I just suck at uploading. You know what also sucks? Persona 5 Royal not being on the Switch until October of 2022. You see, after Joker got added into Smash in late 2018, many Nintendo fans wanted Persona 5 to be ported onto the Switch. And Atlus listened! Kind of. In early 2020, Persona 5 Strikers, the hack-and-slash Warriors-type spin-off game, released on Nintendo Switch and PlayStation in Japan. You see, this was still when Atlus didn't do simultaneous worldwide releases, so non-Japanese Switch fans had to wait an additional year for them to get disappointed when it released worldwide in early 2021. But since Persona 5 Royal released on Nintendo Switch a year and a half later, we can now take a look at this game for what it is, a spin-off rather than a complete replacement for Persona 5. But it is a hack-and-slash game, and those are known for, well, kind of being a turn off your brain and play it type of game. So does this game still hold up 4 years later? Did I go back to sleep for another 3 months? And that's what this video intends to find out. Here's my experience playing Persona 5 Strikers completely blind. Oh right, I still do have to buy that game. Whew! I did it. I'm no longer scared of M's. You want to know a fun fact? This game was actually referenced as Persona 5 2 in the promotional material for this game. And yeah, I can kinda see why. This game's story acts as a direct follow-up to Persona 5, not Royal, story. The events in this game happen approximately 6 months after the end of Persona 5 and chronicle the experiences the group goes through during their summer vacation. As someone who played Persona 5 Royal and absolutely loved Kazumi, it was disappointing to see her not mentioned at all within the story, but I understand why, since Royal was released in Japan only 3 months before Strikers was released. However, all 8 of the OG cast return, and it was super fun to see them all interact. Since Persona 5's story only has the characters interact with other people outside of Joker on certain dates where the story progresses, interactions between characters outside of Joker and them, especially for members who joined late in the story like Futaba and Haru, were much less than others like An and Ryuji who joined earlier. Persona 5 Strikers has the group interacting with each other all the time since they are traveling together, and it was so nice to see. Characters like Haru and Futaba got more screen time that they needed, and it added to my love of all of the original cast. But since this game happened 6 months after the original, there is little to no character development that happens for the original cast. Some characters learn more about themselves or see how they could have potentially ended up had they not met the group, but I would not say they develop as characters. I don't blame Atlus for this. I mean, after the life-altering events of Persona 5, you're not just going to forget the ideologies and lessons you learned in 6 months. The lack of character development in this game is great for Persona 5 players so they don't have to relive the same story again, but for those who come into this game with no context of Persona 5, the story falls flat in my opinion. This game does introduce 2 new main characters in Zenkichi and Sophia, both great characters that do develop as the game progresses. But if only 2 out of 10 main characters are developing, it still ends up in an overall meh story from an objective viewpoint. To give credit to Atlus, they were thinking of Switch players when making this game, as when a character or event from Persona 5 gets brought up or referenced, some other character will say a brief explanation of what happened or who the person is. Kinda like this. Oh yeah, how is Sai doing, Makoto? Oh, Sai? You mean Makoto's super cool sister who's also a super cool lawyer? We all saw her 6 months ago. Who the frick are you explaining this to? And while the reminders are nice if it has been a while since you've played Persona 5, they aren't replacements for playing the game and understanding the story. If you don't know the full context of what they're referencing, the references will ultimately fall flat and won't mean much to you. They do this a good amount so players who didn't play Persona 5 will feel a bit lost and not relate to the characters when they do this. So while I think this is a near perfect sequel story to Persona 5, I think it's a below average story for anyone who hasn't played Persona 5. A lot of the enjoyment I got out of the story was seeing the OG cast interact with each other again in a more laid back environment and facing their new challenges together. You don't get that enjoyment if you haven't played Persona 5, meaning that it falls flat for those people. In short, if you've played Persona 5, it's a great story. If not, you'll likely be disappointed in it, which is unfortunate. Alright, for gameplay I will split it up into 3 parts. One talking about the combat of the game, one for the jails, and the other for everything else. So let's start with the combat. It's a common fact that these Warriors type games are mostly turn off your brain and hit enemy type of games. Koei Tecmo are the kings of this genre, making their own series called Dynasty Warriors and also collaborating with Nintendo on creating The Legend of Zelda and Fire Emblem spin-offs in this genre. So when I saw Koei Tecmo was the developer in this game, I was a bit concerned I would have a similar experience to Hyrule Warriors, where I had fun, but it wasn't really that engaging, and I wouldn't come back to it. Luckily, I was pleasantly surprised. The game still does keep the core gameplay of these types of games, where you only have to really press 2 or 3 buttons to do combos and you mostly fight hordes of enemies. However, there is a lot of Persona 5 influence in this game's combat. For one, Persona's return. Well, obviously, they'd be here, but they bring with them more of the mechanics of Persona 5, like type weaknesses and strengths. Like in the original, each Persona has strengths and weaknesses, with some being a fit for a mage like Ann, or a strong physical and gun attacker like Haru, so you can build your team around these strengths and weaknesses. Type weaknesses also make a grand return, with each Shadow and Persona having the same weaknesses they had in the original. If you are able to strike a weakness on a Shadow, it will chip down their shield, and once that breaks, you can hit them with an all-out attack for massive damage. Also, like in Persona 5, critical hits and technical hits will also chip down this shield as well. If a Shadow has multiple shields, breaking one of these will stun them temporarily, allowing you to get in a 1 more attack for additional damage. And sometimes allies will assist you for this attack by pressing their direction on the D-pad if prompted. In fact, if you want to play as an ally, all you have to do is press the direction on the D-pad anytime during the battle. I thought this was a really fun mechanic, as each ally has a different playstyle. For example, Joker is the wild card, so he can change between personas at will, so some of his attacks will vary based on his persona. But Sophia is someone who uses yo-yos as her primary weapon, and timing your attack presses to when she catches the yo-yos allows you to do additional damage. Each character has a unique playstyle, so even if you don't like a certain playstyle, you can always try another. You're bound to find a character you like playing as. Unfortunately, just like in Persona 5, you are limited to only having 4 team members within the main party at a time, but you can switch them out anytime outside of battle, which is something the game encourages. Besides all-out attacks, you do have another option to deal massive damage. They are called Showtime attacks, where you will do a large amount of damage to an area of enemies, regardless of their type weaknesses and strengths. You can unleash one after you fill the Showtime meter, which you will fill during combat. These are a fun incentive to try to unleash in each battle, and can be used to mow down a large group of enemies quickly. Nothing too crazy, but fun nonetheless. Status effects also return from Persona 5 and have somewhat similar effects in this context, but these can be easily healed using an ability you learn pretty early in the game on multiple characters or through items you provide. Oh yeah, you can just hit the pause button and completely stop a fight if you so choose to heal your team while in the battle. Admittedly, this makes the game a whole lot easier, as long as you stock up, but given the nature of this game and the rarity of SP items, it was kind of a necessity. Ultimately, it is optional, and how much advantage of this you take is up to you, but I will admit it kind of breaks up the flow of gameplay whenever you do it. However, what flows really well is using the world around you. Depending on the arena that you find yourself in, you may find certain objects you can jump to. Some objects will allow you to then dash to a location, or you can deal damage to a group of enemies. Or it may allow you to blow something up or drop it to the ground. These actions are tied to a type of damage, so you may be able to strike an enemy's weakness using these. Timing when using them effectively is important to winning battles with minimal healing needed, and wasting them will make your life harder. Speaking of arenas, there are a few battles within the game which lock you into an arena and have you protect Futaba while she is attacking. These fights are just a timed battle and are pretty easy since you can heal Futaba when needed, but they're a nice change of pace when they do happen. There is also a dodge function in this game which works pretty smoothly. I noticed that I never really felt any discrepancy from what I got hit with or actually dodged, which is important when you have so much happening on screen at all times. You can eventually unlock a perfect parry type of mechanic which will allow you to automatically counterattack and attack if you dodge at the perfect time, adding a bit of skill expression into the game which I found fun to take advantage of. Overall, the combat in this game is pretty fun. I know that some of the mechanics are borrowed from other games that Koei Tecmo makes and they just renamed them here, but I think the Persona weaknesses and strengths facet unique to this game makes it so that you can't just turn your brain off and play. You do have to so much strategize in each battle and pay attention to what patterns the enemy is doing, although the latter only really applies to strong enemies or bosses. I'd say in the genre, this is probably the most solid gameplay in it, at least compared to what I've seen from other games in the genre. It still is mostly only pressing 2 or 3 buttons and doing combos, but adding the strengths and weaknesses mechanic does add a layer of depth that the other games in the genre do lack. Now, if you've played other Warriors-type games, you might be confused as to why I need a whole section for this. In those games, typically you just select a mission and then go into the combat section of the game where you defend or take over areas of the map. What is so interesting about that? Well, Persona 5 Strikers actually incorporates some features of Persona 5 Palaces and puts them into this game's jails, as they are called. Outside of combat, there are still things to think about, and you cannot just run through the jail all willy-nilly. Firstly, the security level returns. However, it is not really that punishing. If the security level gets too high, only treasure chests in the jail will lock up, not allowing them to be opened until the security level goes down. And like Persona 5, you want to stay out of sight of shadows, and now spotlights to prevent it from going up, even if the punishment isn't that bad. However, staying out of sight of shadows can be a bit difficult sometimes. There are certain spots that are designated hiding spots, but they are not too common. Often you will have to run around their vision, and although they won't hear every sound cue you put out, they will hear them if you get close. I do wish there were more spots to jump to, as when I attacked enemies from these spots, it felt much more satisfying than simply running up behind them. Now, wait a second. Attack? Well, yeah, like in Persona 5, in order to engage in a battle with an enemy, you need to hit an enemy with an attack, whether that be with a gun from long range or a slice with your weapon. A good chunk of battles are avoidable if you so choose, and as long as you don't alert an enemy where they see you, you can run around a lot of them. You can get punished for doing this stuff. If an enemy does see you and gets close enough, it'll attack you first, knocking you down temporarily, allowing the enemy to get a few free hits in. But you can do that too. If you're able to sneak up on an enemy before they figure out that you're near them, you can pull off an ambush. Doing this will allow you to get the first strike, a guaranteed critical hit to any enemies that spawn in your vicinity. This puts you in a perfect position to pull off an all-out attack or one more attack for free at the start of the battle. Pulling off an ambush also decreases the security level more than just winning a battle. I will say, pulling off ambushes is incredibly satisfying, and I love that they incorporated a lot of the palace mechanics from Persona 5 in this game. While defending and taking over keeps in other Warriors games does work, I didn't feel like they fit for a Persona type of game. So rather than taking the Warriors format, they just molded Persona 5's Palace system to fit in a hack-and-slash system, and it is done well. You can also still grab items in jails, but they're just in these little boxes around the map that you collect. They're all items that you can sell in the shop for extra cash, so usually going out of your way for like 5 seconds to grab them is worth it. Not really satisfying or anything, but at least it gives a collectible to grab outside of trying to get the jump on shadows, which is the only other thing that happens in the jails. My only other gripe with this is that I felt the shadows hearing was a bit odd. Like I would run up behind a shadow and it would hear me, so instead of an ambush I would just attack it normally, not netting the benefits. I think they changed the sensitivity or something of the shadows hearing because I could pull off the same move in Persona 5 Royal just fine and get an ambush. Maybe I was just so used to the mechanic in that game that it kinda threw me off in this game. Regardless, I wish the sensitivity was a bit lower, as it was kind of frustrating. It's not anything major, and it doesn't ruin the experience, but that's just my personal opinion on it. Otherwise, this is great. I'm glad that they imported parts of Persona 5's system, and it was done well. Dashing around and being sneaky in jails was satisfying and makes you much more engaged with the game overall, as you weren't just choosing the next mission to get back into the combat. Alright, everything else. What could that possibly encompass? Okay, not that much chill out here. Everything you do outside of combat is meant to make your combat life easier. And honestly, there are a surprising amount of things you can do to make it easier. Let's start with perhaps the most important thing, the bond skills. So, bond skills act as sort of buffs for your team. For example, you can unlock a skill that increases every party member's max HP by 5. Or you can use it on a certain skill that affects combat, such as the aforementioned counterattack. There are a lot of skills you could unlock and level up throughout the game, and if I mentioned all of them, we'd be here for a while. But what I will mention is that these bond skills aren't limited to combat bonuses or buffs. There are also other skills that buff things that happen outside of combat. You can increase the amount of money you receive after each battle, or make it so items in Sophia's shop will go on sale for a cheaper price. I think the bond skill system is really cool because it allows the player the ability to make their playthrough unique to others. If you're someone who wants to make sure to always have money on hand to buy items, you can just buff the skill that allows you to get more money at the end of each battle. or maybe you value base stats more than anything else. You can also buff those skills more than others if you choose. But before you can do any of that, you'll need bond points to unlock these skills. Well, how do I get that, you might be asking? Unfortunately, I couldn't find them at my local grocery store, but I did find this cool mattress topper. Rather, you get bond points from the bond meter. Each time your bond level goes up, you receive bond points which you then use to unlock or level up your bond skills. There are 3 primary ways to increase your bond level, which are progressing the main story, fighting shadows, and doing certain requests, which I'll get to here in a second. Overall, I feel like the bond meter is pretty fair, although I would recommend maxing out the skill that increases how quickly the meter goes up. I think I got to a little over level 40 by the end of my playthrough. Also, the points you get per level up increase exponentially as you get higher into the levels. By the end of my playthrough, I think I was getting like around 14 points per level up. It's a fun mechanic in the game that encourages you to do everything the game offers to increase your level on the meter. Trust me, it makes the game easier in a lot of different ways, but if you don't want any of the buffs, it is completely optional if you want to go that route. Alright, now let's talk about requests. After progressing in the game a bit, you'll unlock the requests feature. These act as sort of side quests that you can do throughout the game. Like the bond feature, they're completely optional, and you don't have to do any of them if you don't want to. Most of the time, they boil down to either defeating a certain number of enemies, sometimes in a certain way, like using a phantom dash, finding a certain area with a hint given in the request, or having a persona with a certain ability. They do usually reward you handsomely for doing these requests, giving you better items than you can currently buy, or increasing the amount of items you can buy in the shop. For most of them, they do genuinely make it worth your while to commit a bit of time outside of the main story for these. Although I didn't do all of the requests, I thought these were a nice distraction from the main game. They add around an additional 5-ish hours to the game if you do a good chunk of them. Other features, such as cooking and the Velvet Room, have also made their way over from Persona 5. Cooking is a bit different from the original, where now you have to buy ingredients, and you also must acquire recipes. These both can be purchased in the various towns you go to, and also online. This is a good way to get SP items, and most of the time the recipes and the ingredients aren't too expensive, so it's worth the money investment. The Velvet Room acts the exact same as the original. Go in, combine 2 weaker personas to get a stronger persona than before. It heavily encourages you to do this consistently, as personas will stop learning abilities once they hit a certain level, capping their usefulness. It does force you to play multiple playstyles throughout the game, so it's a good feature in my opinion. Finally, you have to walk around. And the award for Game of the Year is Persona 5 Strikers. So throughout the game, you'll travel to various cities, each with their own shops and stuff. While Sophia's shop is nice and where you will likely get most of your items throughout the game, the shops in each city sell exclusive items that you won't be able to get once you leave for quite a while. I found that the items in the city were often much better than the ones you could find in Sophia's shop, so it is worth going out. However, these shops refresh less than Sophia's does, so it balances itself. Unfortunately, I'm used to Persona 5 Royal, so not having a run button and being stuck at lightly jogging pace was not fun. The cities are not that large, and you could run from one end to the next within like 3 minutes without fast travel, so it's not really a huge issue, but come on guys, you put it in Royal, could you not put it in this game too? And that about wraps up this section of gameplay. It's overall pretty solid, and although it isn't the most in-depth out-of-combat gameplay, it serves its purpose and it doesn't keep you from getting back into the meat of the game, the combat, for too long. Welcome to the Miscellaneous section, where I talk about other stuff that didn't really fit into any of the categories, but I still feel are important to mention. Firstly, the load times. This game was released in early 2021, and is still on its original patch that it released with. One of the main complaints that I saw around that time about this game, at least on the Switch version, was the loading times. And yeah, I can kind of tell why it was such a large complaint. Although I didn't pull out a timer or anything, entering into jails or leaving them would take at least 20 to 25 seconds. However, this seemed to preload all of the stuff you would need once you entered or left, because the loads would only be like 5 to 7 seconds once you got into the jail or into the city. But it doesn't just end there, because sometimes loading into cutscenes would also take a bit. You could easily tell when the game was trying to load in an area and a cutscene because the load would take longer. However, most cutscenes are rendered in-game, so they don't really take that much longer to load. The Velvet Room also would take a while to load in and out of, especially if you visited the door in the city instead of going while in the van. Other than that though, the load times weren't really anything I felt was egregious for a Switch game. I can only think of one time where the load times were actually egregious, like 40 seconds, but it was loading a cutscene and a battle, so it was somewhat forgivable. Now, do note that this opinion comes from someone who primarily plays games on the Switch and also had to deal with the Wii U's load times for an entire generation. I think the load times may not seem that bad if the Switch is your primary console, since Switch games typically have longer load times for games like this, but if you're coming from another console, you'll likely notice the load times are a lot more than primarily Switch users. As for the frame rate, obviously the game is maxed out at 30 FPS, but in terms of noticeable frame drops, I didn't have that many. Usually the frame drops would occur when a new enemy wave was spawning and there were already a ton of enemies on screen. However, the frame drops never lasted for more than a second. I'm sure the frames do dip a bit when you go into battle since there's a lot more happening on screen, but I, at least, didn't notice worse performance. Now, if you're a guy who gets really close to their TV to count frames, your mileage may vary, but if you don't care about frames outside of noticeable slowdown like me, this game is perfectly playable. I don't usually bring up the difficulty of the game in my reviews, but if you want an actual challenge, do not play on normal mode. I default to normal mode on any game I play, and the game is not that challenging on that difficulty. I had a few close calls, but I never had one game over the entire playthrough. Warriors games are historically not that difficult, at least from what I've seen, but I was still kind of surprised at how easily I breezed through the game. This isn't a knock against the game, but I figured it was something I should mention. As for the music, it's still amazing. Wynn returns for a few vocal songs on the soundtrack, and Atlus composers teamed up with Koei Tecmo's composers to make remixes and new tracks for this game. It has a different vibe than Persona 5, but it still feels like a game within that universe. The remixes are actual bangers. I love how they redid the songs like Last Surprise for this game. Hearing that in the game for the first time was an ethereal feeling. The new original vocal songs for this game are also classics as well. It's unfortunate that these aren't recognized as much as the ones from Persona 5. I would highly recommend playing this game with headphones for the full experience. As for the UI, it's obviously inspired by Persona 5, but isn't as dynamic. It works well, characters appear and move around as you move around the menus, still giving them some flair. It's still way more interesting than most other games on the market, and it functions perfectly fine. Not really much more to say about it. I think that's all the other stuff I wanted to mention, but when we combine all the aspects of this game, does it still hold up? Throughout this video, I tried to avoid direct comparisons to Persona 5 as much as possible. While this game is still in that universe and shares its story, directly comparing the game is unfair to this game. Although it is a spin-off, it is a completely different game with completely different mechanics. Comparing a turn-based RPG to a hack-and-slash Warriors type game would be unfair to both games. Heck, it would be unfair to Koei Tecmo as well. These games are their specialty, and though Atlus helped with development, I imagine it was only with stuff like the story and other non-combat elements. Koei Tecmo's specialty is the combat of Warriors games, and comparing that to Atlus's turn-based RPG combat would be unfair to them. This game was never meant to replace Persona 5, but that's kinda what it was on the Switch for a year and a half, which I think skewed some early impressions of the game. But now that Persona 5 Royal is on the Switch, it's settled into its spot of being a spin-off to the main game. So, how well does it do in that role? And I have to say, it does really well. I have my gripes with the game, which I mentioned in this video, but the overall package is incredibly solid. I would not put this game anywhere near my favorite games of all time, but I was pleasantly surprised that I enjoyed the game as much as I did. Its combat is fun, the story is a great follow-up to Persona 5, not Royal's story, and although the game is not that long, only lasting around 37 hours for my entire playthrough without doing any stuff post-final boss, there's a lot of content here that could easily push your playthrough to around 40 to 45 hours. I could see myself coming back to play this game years down the line, which is not something I could say about Hyrule Warriors. I would recommend this game to anyone who has played Persona 5 or Royal. These games are incredibly easy to get into, and 40 hours is not that much of a time investment, unlike the original's 80 plus hours you have to commit to beating it. I would recommend getting it on PlayStation since it's 100% the better version of this game, but if you only have a Switch, it's still a perfectly serviceable version of it as long as you're willing to wait a bit longer on the loading screens. As for the price point, I'm about to say something shocking. This game is 3 years old, everywhere outside of Japan. Therefore, it's likely to go on sale semi-frequently. I got my copy digitally on Switch for $18, which is more than worth it. I'd say the game is worth the retail price of $60, but at this point it's probably better to wait for it to go on sale since it's that old. There is a deluxe version of this game, but all it adds is additional music from other Persona games, some art book stuff, and a video which you can all find online. So I wouldn't say it's worth spending the extra cash on unless it's like $1 more and you really want the additional Persona battle themes. And if you haven't played Persona 5 or Royal, I mean, if you're just looking for a solid Warriors game and you don't really care about the story, then this game is probably the best on the market. But if you do want a cool story to go alongside the game, then I would highly recommend playing Persona 5 Royal first. Like this game, the game is starting to get old, so it's going on sale more frequently. There's also a super easy mode in that game, so if you just want to experience the story and not deal with the RPG elements too much, that mode is perfect. I made a video about that game if you're really interested in my thoughts. Overall, I really enjoyed this game and it was a pleasant surprise, but that's all I have to say for this video. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. I upload every couple of months at this point, so if you're looking for a channel to jump scare you in your subscription feed every 3 months, then well, you found the perfect place. I hope you all have a wonderful day, evening, night, wherever you are, and this is Crystalized, signing out. I'll be back. Eventually. For sure this time. I'm sure glad I finished the Persona 5 series. Now I can finally move on to another gaming... Oh, you've gotta be kidding me.